7. Incest and Lot's daughters. In the Institutes of Biblical Law, pages 368 to 375, I point out that, prior to Moses, there was no law against incest. Since Adam and his descendants had inherent in them all the genetic possibilities of the human race, his children, in marrying one another, were not as closely related genetically as any two Navajo Indians are today. Abraham married Sarah, possibly a half-sister, Genesis chapter 20, verse 12, and the father of Moses, Amram, married a young aunt, his father's sister, Jochebed, Exodus chapter 6, verse 20. When God, through Moses, forbade incest, Leviticus chapter 18, verses 7 to 17, chapter 20, verses 11 and 12 and 14, 17, 20 and 21, Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 30, chapter 27, verse 20, verse 22 and verse 23, and required the death penalty for most instances of it, it was, first, a radical break with accepted worldwide practice, and second, established a roadblock to genetic damage which was to appear only many centuries later as inbreeding began to become more prone to concentrate defective genes. It is important, thus, not to read back into early history this subsequent prohibition. The story of Lot and his daughters is an instance of this fallacious and moralistic reading. Almost all commentators show only horror for the daughters' act. R. Payne Smith spoke of the revolting conduct of these women and declared, "The utter degradation of Lot and his family is the most painful part of his story, which thus ends in his intense shame." Cuthbert A. Simpson, who regards the narrative as myth, not history, is still closer to the truth when he writes of Genesis chapter 19, verse 31. "There is not a man on earth to come in unto us." That is, presupposes that the background of the tale was worldwide disaster, such as the flood, which had wiped out the human race. The action of the two women was thus, in its original setting, heroic, and the story was doubtless told with pride by their supposed descendants. Clearly, the girls viewed their action as good, and the names they gave their sons indicate only a pride in their action as good. Moab means from my father, and Ben-Ami, son of my kinsman. Very obviously, they felt that they acted to save the human race from extinction, and that, like Noah and his family, they were its sole survivors. Something more must be said about Lot's daughters. They left Sodom with their father and chose not to return with their mother. Their mother's acts indicated a lack of faith. She returned, perhaps in an interlude in the destruction, assuming that it was over. Her wealthy home and all its advantages were in Sodom. No doubt Lot had left with horses, camels, or donkeys loaded with food and gold. In the cave, Genesis chapter 19, verse 30 following, they obviously had food and wine brought with them. What they brought with them seemed trifling compared to what was left behind, and Lot's wife chose to return in some interlude in the general destruction, since it appeared that, despite some damage, Sodom would survive. Clearly, she had no faith in the message of the two strangers. The daughters just as clearly shared Lot's faith, and they chose to stay with their father. As the destruction continued, it began to appear as a worldwide catastrophe comparable to the flood, which, to Lot and his daughters, was fairly recent history. Although one of the angels or messengers assured them that the small town of Zoar would not be overthrown, Genesis chapter 19, verse 21, in the general rain of fire and brimstone which followed, it seemed to Lot that Zoar also would perish, and he fled from it also, although earlier pleading to stay there because he feared the disaster would overwhelm him in the open country and the hills. Genesis chapter 19, verses 19 and 30. A city with buildings had briefly seemed the best protection of all, but after the upheaval and destruction began, only a cave seemed protection enough. After the conduct of the men of Sodom, Genesis chapter 19, verses 4 and 5, it seemed to Lot and his daughters that God's anger, once unleashed, would destroy at least all of Canaan and that part of the world, if not the whole world. The daughters thus assumed with Lot that they were either the lone survivors on earth, or else, if other areas were spared, they were too far away to be reached. This meant an unstable faith in the declared word, but it was still a faith therein, and with it a desire to perpetuate God's apparently chosen man, Lot. The history of Sodom's fall shows Lot as deeply distressed and indecisive out of horror, but withal obedient to God. Lot was hated by the Sodomites because, as a judge sitting in the gates, he was a lone voice against the evils of the city. Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 and 9. Before we condemn Lot, let us remember that, in like circumstances, few men would do better. Let us remember, too, that God declares him to be just Lot and speaks of him as that righteous man. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. Let us remember also Lot's exhaustion, having spent the night trying to arouse his married children to the danger. We must remember, too, that Lot's daughters are not condemned in the narrative. Incest was not yet under the ban of the law. This did not mean that the girls were guiltless. First, they made their father drunk, thereby taking leadership into their hands. Clearly, they felt with some apparent ground that their father was too grief-stricken and ill to make any decisions, and they used this as a justification for taking the initiative. Second, it was fornication, and again an offence against God's law and their father. Depraved they were not. Sinners they were. They were not unbelievers, and in a critical situation, they had acted on faith, but their faith was a defective one,